So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Mike, and he will tell us more.
Well, thank you very much, Greg, and Practical Farmers of Iowa for the opportunity to share our observations of the farm leasing industry and our experiences, and certainly land rent discussions. So we appreciate that. A quick introduction to us. Next Gen Ag Advocates is a relatively new company here in just the last 3 years, actually founded by two farmers from Iowa. Picture there, the two on the right. In the middle there is Glenn Moeller, and he retired in 2015 after 40 years of farming. And he didn't have a successor to carry on his operation. And his story is, largely responsible for the start of Next Gen. And we're helping other retiring farmers, connecting them with young producers and how to best structure those, and so forth. Myself, I grew up on a family farm down in West Central Illinois, and didn't have the opportunity to go back to my family farm. I can still remember vividly 20 years ago when I was graduating the University of Illinois, price of corn was about $1.80, and soybeans were about $5.50. So I still remember that quite vividly. And so my first job out of college actually brought me to Eastern Iowa in Mount Vernon, where I'm still at today. Started out working with a farm management company here in Iowa for a number of years, working with a lot of landowners and producers. And but about 10, 11 years ago, I first met Steve Bohr, the other founder here of Next Gen on the right. He's a farmer, but has also been helping farmers, landowners with their farm transition for almost the last 30 years. Some people recognize him or have heard him or have read him because he writes a monthly column in the Iowa Farmer Today about farm transition. And I first met him, about 10, 11 years ago when my parents had just gone through some challenges with each of my grandparents' estates. They wanted to meet with somebody. I just happened to drive by Steve's office every day. And I guess the rest of the story is history, because Steve is actually one of the owners of a company called Farm Financial Strategies, which I'm an associate of with Steve today, which traditionally has worked with farm families that do have a family heir, a son or daughter, to transition the farm to. Next Gen is more about helping with transition between non-related families, and there's a lot of that type of transition occurring out there. And then we get involved with facilitating some lease relationships with some of those matches. When we think about the next generation, when you look at the age of the landowner currently, there's certainly going to be a lot of transition to occur. 85% is estimated of farmland to be owned by those age 55 years or older. It's kind of crazy to think the other side of that, only 15% of the land is owned by those 55 years or younger. And we're trying to match that group up with the next generation of producers. And when you think about the next generation, the fact that it's estimated 68% of farmers do not have children who currently farm. Over half have not identified a successor. And I think everybody's aware of the age demographics. For every farmer under the age of 35, there are 6 over the age of 65. So certainly this is a lot about what Next Gen, what we were founded, what our vision is to help better connect these two groups going forward. Steve first wrote his first column in the Iowa Farmer Today was 7 or 8 years ago, and his first article was about the perfect storm in farm transition. I won't go into a lot of detail about this slide. We go into more detail on this one if we're being asked to more specifically talk about farm transition or succession planning. But the reason I bring this slide up is we believe there's a new element to this involving farm leasing. And when you look at some of the estimates that 80% of rented farmland may be owned and controlled by those that don't operate it themselves. Over half of Iowa farms are rented. In some counties, upwards of 70% of them are. And then about a third of Iowa land is owned by those with no farm experience. So to us, that's a new element when we think about farm transition, that this can put a lot more emphasis on landlord-tenant relationships, maybe more so that we've ever seen up to this point. And so again, that's another reason why, we're trying to help facilitate some of these discussions with the next generation. And this is right from our webpage, and we look in the middle there of a lot of the family farms that are going to transition. Many will transition to a generation that did not grow up on the farm or operate it themselves. So, we believe there's this gap that we're trying to bridge, whether that's providing some education to the next generation or better communicating with the next generation. Those are all things that we're trying to do. And as we look at the industry, there's certainly going to be a lot more pressure on that as more and more farms transition. So here's 5 observations I thought I'd share that we have. Certainly there's others that could be added to this list, but from our perspective, these are 5, kind of our top 5 that come to mind. First of all, the most common method of establishing cash rent is to set it at a rate similar to what other people are charging in the area. This comes verbatim from the Iowa State Farmland Leasing booklet from back in 2019. But the concern that we have, sometimes that leads to what we call coffee shop talk. We probably all can think of examples of that in our own neighborhood, but I can think back when I was working more in the farm management industry that, several times I was asked from a landowner to put a farm out for bids, for example. I was never a real huge fan of that, but every time I did do that, if we rented the farm at this level, it seemed like the rumorville or the coffee shop talk was that we rented it up here at this level. Unfortunately, when other landowners and producers hear this level up here, sometimes they take that verbatim and actually believe that that's accurate data. And that impacts all of us in our own neighborhoods on, when we're looking at the land rental market. Secondly, if there's 3 approaches to establishing a fair rental agreement, these are the 3 that we would propose. There's a feasible way. That's the way that if we're trying to establish a rate that my tenant's able to pay at a profitable level. There's an equitable way, what's fair to both sides. And then probably the most common way in the industry right now is just based on market value. What's our neighbors willing to pay? And we've seen even some more increased examples just in the last year of more online venues, rental auctions, which are a concern when we look at what's occurring in the row crop production agriculture that's leading and just continuing to contribute to consolidation. And these are all points that I'm going to share here in subsequent slides, but I just kind of want to lead here with these 4 or 5 points. The third one, most land rents are negotiated well ahead of when the crop is harvested. To us, that's a timing issue, and I'll touch on that more here in a slide coming up. Number 4, fair income, and how that's changed over the last 30 to 40 years. And what is fair? How are we going about to establish that? And number 5, I think this is a big one, especially as it relates to a lot of the things that groups like Practical Farmers of Iowa are trying to do. But the farmland leasing trends out there, we don't believe really correlate that well with conservation, land stewardship, and certainly there's an increased focus on those in the industry. So here's some examples that we've seen here in the last year or two, some different ways that folks are renting farmland. This is an example of 80 acres that was offered for sale up in northern Iowa. But attached to that was the option to rent an additional 744 acres. Rental price $285 per acre for 3 years. Great opportunity for a producer up there. But our question is that really a whopper cash rent opportunity like it was, advertised in this article? And how did they establish? Where did they come up with the rental rate of $285? Was that just based on, again, just what we hear our neighbors are paying? And certainly back then, we did not have commodity prices like we do today. We were at much lower levels. So 285, you'd have to have a really sharp pencil to have that to pencil out. Here's another example down in southern Iowa. This is actually 1,000 acres that was offered for rent via a online rent auction. They actually received 47 bids from 5 different states. And you can see the size of that circle to reach 5 different states. That's a 230-mile radius, a 3.5-hour car trip one way by car, let alone a tractor or a combine. One of the winning bids came from 85 miles away, so that radius got a little smaller, but you can still see it's 2 or 3 counties wide. And kind of our concern with this is just when you think about consolidation and what's occurring out there, just with the number of farmers and what happens when our number of farmers start diminishing. Do we really need to go 85 miles away to find a qualified producer? Do we truly know every producer in our own township? So that's some of the conversations that we're trying to promote is, consolidation, change is going to occur, but, there's a way to do this responsibly and find producers in our own neighborhood that are more apt to support our local businesses, school districts, ag businesses, and so forth. So here's speaking to consolidation, this is all the companies that represent Chem China. Down in lower left, Gar Seed Company, my dad and uncle raised Gar seed corn and sold Gar seed corn. And I know my dad nor the Garst family probably ever imagined that Garst would be part of a company called Chem China one day. We've seen this consolidation in the livestock industry already. There's primarily 3 or 4 companies that dominate that industry. And obviously we're starting to see that now in row crop with primarily 4 companies in the seed and chemical industry. And, certainly that picture in the bottom right hand corner has less look and feel of a family farm operation to me than the one above it. So, but unfortunately, the operations like this in the future are going to be the ones that have the economies of scale, the competitive advantage to go after some of these rent opportunities that are being offered, through online venues or rent auctions, those sort of environments. This is a relatively new thing. If I was live in the front of the room with you, I'd ask you to raise your hands if any of you have received a letter as landowners from a company offering you a cash rental price on your farm, even though you have an existing relationship with a farm tenant already. But there are companies out there that are starting to do this, internet-based companies. This letter actually was sent to Howard Bohr, which is my partner, Steve Bohr's father. Steve actually rents their family farm, and his father received this out of the blue here over the winter. And the company was offering, $334 an acre to rent Howard's farm, and then they would go find a renter basically to try to pay that or more potentially. So we're seeing more of this too. Social media, internet platforms. This is an example of a client of ours that here in eastern Iowa that has a 250-acre farm, and they sure enough saw one of these companies advertising on the internet on Facebook, and out of curiosity, he reached out to him, and sure enough, the company offered them to lease his farm, $321 an acre for 3 years with all of the rent paid up front within 7 days to boot. So, certainly get your attention when you see these type of offers being made. And, the company didn't even have a renter secured, but, promised that the renter they find wouldn't come from any more than 50 miles away. But, there's a lot of questions we believe landowners should be asking about these type of examples. First of all, how are they able to do this? Who are their investors? Who is backing them? What's their motives? Secondly, who are they going to subrent the farm to? this particular landowner was the reason why he was tempted to reach out is because he wasn't exactly happy with his current renter. Actually, it was determined that he had depleted about $40,000 worth of fertility from the farm. But who's to say this company comes in and doesn't rent it to the same renter he was working with before that he's not happy with? So that's certainly a valid question. And the last one is why? Why are they doing this? I think this image is one that I use a lot that explains the why. When you look at the farmland, some of the most productive farmland in the world is right here where we're sitting in the Midwest. And so certainly that's, I think, one of the reasons why we see more and more companies and non-farming groups, investors taking an interest in farmland. And obviously this helps support that too. You know, you've all heard the saying, dirt, they're not making any more of it. In fact, we've lost quite a bit of it over the last 30 years. It's estimated we've lost 31 million acres to development and urban sprawl. So that's why farmland continues to stay in demand. And there's recent articles that some of you've probably seen that the largest landowner right now is Bill Gates, the owner of Microsoft. And there's also been articles recently out there that the Chinese have bought farmland in Oklahoma and Texas. And so, yeah, there's definitely a lot more groups other than farmers that are interested in farmland that's impacting farmland, but also impacting farmland returns and cash rental rates. This is a chart just showing the typical return to farmland going back to the 1970s. And we believe this disconnect is a real event that unfortunately probably is not going to go away, just because those buying land are just perfectly comfortable, a lot of them, with a 2.5% return just to own a long-term asset like farmland. And so there's this growing disconnect occurring between farm profit margins and what people are willing to pay for ground. And that affects land rents because historically land rents tend to follow farmland values up and down. And this kind of leads to what we call the cash rent lag effect, which is typical when we have a fixed cash rent lease that's negotiated year to year. And this chart just basically shows over the last 10 years, you can see as corn prices went higher, cash rents followed, but kind of lagged behind because we're typically only setting those rental rates at one given time in the year. So when there's a lot of volatility in the markets, sometimes it's hard to keep pace with what's occurring. Just as we've kind of come back down, rents have lagged behind. You can see, generally speaking, cash rent values today are $40, $50 an acre higher than 10 years ago, the last time we had commodity prices where we do now. Now, this chart doesn't take into account the recent strength we've had in grain prices. So it'll be interesting to see if we start another cycle here, another upward movement or not. But sometimes when we see this type of an environment, that question at the bottom, are we truly creating a win-win relationship when there's all this volatility and we're continually trying to keep pace with what's occurring in the industry and grain prices with our cash rental rates? So it kind of leads to this. Again, if I was in front of you, I'd ask you to raise your hands. Have any of you as producers felt this way during 2020? Certainly it felt like we spent a good portion of the year feeling like this. Now with a little increase in grain prices to start the year, maybe we're starting this cycle again. Maybe we're cautiously optimistic. Time will tell, but we compare this to when you think about your land lease, whether you're a landowner or a producer, what time of the year or where in this cycle are you sitting down to negotiate a fair price? Because what you agree to here might look a lot different than if we're down here, and vice versa. So that kind of leads me to the considerations for the new year 2021. We always like to start, to ask the why. Why, if you're a producer, why do you farm? If you're a landowner, why do you own your land? What about the next generation? What's going to be their motives for farming or for owning continuing to own the land if they're inheriting it? I think these are all valid questions as we think about the next generation and matching them and trying to facilitate a good farm lease relationship. For the producers, usually that answer to that question is, it's in our blood. It's what we were born to do. Freedom and independence to have a farm operation. I'm fortunate to house a tractor from each one of my grandfathers that each of them farmed. And certainly my wife and I feel fortunate to raise our kids on a small farm, for a great way of life, great way to raise a family and around livestock. The other reason from a family legacy standpoint, this is just a clip of an article about the history of Dallas County, where my Downey side of the family farm is from. And it talks about Michael and Timothy Downey, first homesteading and breaking the original prairie back in 1872. So I would be 5th generation, my children 6th generation. So certainly our motives for owning farmland, a lot of it has to do with a family legacy standpoint. So we like to ask this as we're working with landowners and producers, what's important to you? Whether you're a landowner, we've gone through our surveys when we first work with a landowner and a producer, and there isn't a really clear first in the case of a landowner, but stewardship and care of the land is definitely always, it seems to be an important consideration. Receiving a fair income, and then there's all these little things too as a landowner that are important. For a producer, there is in their case a number one that tends to come to the top, and that's they're by far seeking a long-term relationship with landowners and working with the ones that care for the land and have an understanding of what's occurring in farming and for fair lease terms. And I do have an interview with a landowner and a producer that we work with, and I think Greg has those ready to go ahead and play right now.
Let's see. One second.
I'd like to introduce Glenn Moeller, who in 2015 retired from farming after 40 years and has since turned to the other side of the equation where he's
Greg,
now
I can't see the video.
landlord renting out his farmland. And I thought he would offer.
Let me see what's going on here. It keeps disappearing on me. Are you able to see it? No.
Yeah, now I see it. Yeah, go ahead
Okay.
and try. I'd like to introduce Glenn Moeller, who in 2015 retired from farming after 40 years and has since turned to the other side of the equation where he's now a landlord renting out his farmland. And I thought he would offer an interesting perspective to the group. So Glenn, as you know, as a landlord now, when you were seeking out tenants for your farm, what characteristics, what values, what things were you looking for?
Well, Mike, I always seek out the people that have the same respect for the land as what I did. I felt that the conservation practices, maintaining waterways and keeping field borders and everything maintained as they should be, were all practices that I followed and practices that I look at in the tenants that I seek out. Any other practices beyond that are good practices that I encourage. The individual operators have to call the shots on that because I don't dictate anything to them. They have to understand my values and what they need to do, and I think all of them do. So consequently, the conservation plans and the conservation practices are very important to me to maintain the value of my farmland and to be productive for my tenants. Number two is I always sought out tenants that had a succession plan, a brother or a son or a relative of some sort that would be a long-term operator on my farm. So these practices and what's being done has some continuity and continue into the future. I don't really like to seek out different tenants all the time to collect the highest dollar. That's not my motive. The quality of the land and the quality of the tenant is my utmost objective.
I'd like to introduce Jay and Dylan Bulene, who are two farmers that farm together along with their father, and they've never really left the farm, but have been, farming in a full-time capacity here in the last 5 to 7 years when they've come back to the operation. And I've worked with them on a couple situations, and I thought it'd be an interesting perspective now from the producer side, if they could share with us as producers what they're looking for when they're looking to develop a new relationship with a landowner. So Jay, Dylan?
Sure, yeah. One of the things we always look for in working with a landowner is open communication. And that's always been one of the things that we look for. And it helps us explain to the landlord, what we might be running into for complications or issues we may be seeing. New ideas, we're young, we happen to bring some new ideas to the table, and we hope that can be received. But at the end of the day, we think it really comes down to having a good communication system between both the landlord and us as farmers, and that always goes a long way.
Yeah, and thanks, Mike. We also like to look at. It's nice when it's an existing farmer, that we're coming in to take over and either rent the ground and work with that farmer and continue his legacy or her legacy. It's nice from our standpoint because it's someone that has an understanding of the ground. They understand that there needs to be improvements along the way and to keep that the fertility where it is, and maybe look at adding tile and adding some other improvements. It's just when you're working with an existing farmer, they understand that, maybe as compared to somebody that hasn't farmed it. Maybe they just bought the ground and all they look at is the return, or they just look at the dollars at the end of the day. It's just nice to work with somebody that has an understanding that there's we want to continue their legacy, we want to improve their farm, and we just want to do it together with them. So.
All right, Mike, it is back to you. And I do have a couple questions here. Do you want to hear those now?
Sure, yeah, I'll just try to pull my presentation up while you do that.
All right. So Ben asked, what are some solutions to getting the next generation started? If the land is out of reach for most, one young farmer to every 6 older farmers won't cut it in years to come. Economies of scale go so far, but soon those farmers will be extremely inefficient.
So ask the first part of that question again, Greg, I'm sorry.
What are some solutions to getting the next generation started?
Yeah, no, that's certainly a valid question, a valid concern. That's one of the number one deterrents right now for the next generation of farmers, of producers, is the capital required. to get started farming with a line of equipment. Glenn, for example, that we just heard from, he and his brother started their farm operation from scratch, and my grandfather returned from World War II, started our family farm operation from scratch. That's, very unheard of or almost impossible. So, I think we're going to continue to see more non-traditional methods to help young people get involved. And that, just to name a few, some of those non-traditional methods is, one of our founding programs is trying to match non-family young producers to a retiring farmer like Glenn that doesn't have a successor, but doesn't want to just rent their farmland out to the high bidder. Finding those type of opportunities to bring in a young producer from the neighborhood that's like-minded, and we can develop relationships or transition strategies on equipment, how to transition that, and as well as the operation. And so yeah, there's going to be, I think you're going to see more of those non-traditional methods, collaboration. That seems to be a lot of that occurring in the industry, a lot more collaboration between neighboring farm operations, whether that's sharing equipment, or perhaps you as a young producer has access to your family farm or some farmland, but you don't have the equipment. Is there a way we can work together, partner with an operation that has access to equipment and so forth? So those, I think you're going to continue to see those type of more non-traditional methods. Was there another question, Greg? Did you mention too?
No, the next one was more just kind of sharing. The Vicky is a 5th generation landowner that's never farmed and lived out of state, and was sharing how she's been interviewing their process and interviewing some potential tenants. But Carol did ask, can you talk about flex leases and how to set one up?
Yeah, so I'm leading up to that, Carol. So if that's all right, I'm a good portion of the last part of my presentation is on flex leases. So is that okay to delay that, Greg, till we get there?
Yeah, and Vicky did have a follow-up to her sharing. Is there a preferred resource for operating agreement?
For like a farm lease agreement?
Yeah.
Sure. Well, I think, Iowa State University, I know their website has an example of a farm lease. University of Illinois, the Farm Doc. I think there's even some other groups out there like the Land Stewardship organization. Greg, as far as I know, your group might have examples of some farm leases, and certainly our organization does too, that we'd be happy to share. So, but yeah, I think it's in the world we live in today with internet and Google, it's pretty easy to find some examples out there.
Yeah, and I can share some of those there's a files tab on here as well. So I'll share those in there later today, and then if people want to pop back, they can pull those resources out of there.
You bet. So, everybody might have different takeaways from those two interviews we just listened to, but, for me, from the producer standpoint, the two young brothers that are farming, it was interesting to me that they mentioned about, they enjoy working with farmers that understand farming and what they're doing. I don't think they're necessarily trying to discriminate against non-farmers or folks that own land that are more removed. But what I think is interesting is that it leads right to our concern. And one of the reasons why we put Next Gen together to begin with is providing education to that next generation and clear communication with them. Otherwise, where is their source of information going to come from? And if they go to Google or the internet themselves, and the first resource that shows up is a internet company that puts farms out to bid to anybody, in an open environment, that doesn't necessarily complement what we are finding a lot of the goals for landowners, and as we heard from Glenn, one of those he mentioned was the stewardship and quality and care of the land. And that's certainly a big one that we're seeing. And, land stewardship, there's all kinds of organizations that you can find. And obviously Practical Farmers is part of this, that as an industry have a huge focus on stewardship. And so we certainly think it's important with a farm rental agreement to make sure we have one that's set up that incentivizes that. And certainly when you look at, there's other ways we're losing dirt or farmland other than from development or urban sprawl. Unfortunately, that's why I think you see a lot of the initiatives out there for cover crops and regenerative farming, because of some of the statistics you see like you do on this slide. So when we look at land stewardship and some of these programs, and with a farm leasing arrangement, the most common one being done out there is a year-to-year fixed cash rent lease. The problem is a lot of the conservation programs are not year-to-year. They take a long-term investment. So unfortunately, a lot of our rental agreements out there, it's really hard to ask sometimes a producer or a tenant to make investment or commitment into some of these programs when there's a lot of uncertainty on their side that, it's just a year-to-year arrangement. And so that's certainly a concern that we have when we look at the industry. Cover crops, I think one of the most common question in the 20 years I've been working with farm leases with cover crops is who should pay for it. Should the tenant pay for it because they're running the farm, or should the landowner pay for it because they own the farm, or should it be shared? There's certainly lease insertions you can make into your lease to account for how you want to set that up. Are we going to make a concession in the rent? If we're asking our tenant to plant cover crops, and so forth. A lot of questions when it comes with that, with how to handle that with farm leases. There's other insertions you can make on, if they're making personal improvements like drainage tile. This could apply to conservation programs too, that if we're asking our tenant to bear those costs, that we can at least itemize those out and amortize them. So, if for some reason he or she is not renting the farm 2 or 3 years from now, we can at least build in a reimbursement of some of the out-of-pocket expense they had to help them incentivize up front that they're being taken care of. But when we look at it from, I guess, a bigger picture, what's really the underlying thing under every relationship, and that's the farm lease. And certainly a crop share arrangement where we're sharing in income and expense, we're sharing the risk and reward. We're also sharing in the cost of farm improvements or conservation programs. That's a lot easier discussion to have, and maybe there's less pressure on who's paying for it when we're sharing in those expenses. When you think of,
Mike, Ruth asked a question about, in perfect timing, some advice on how to have that conversation with the farmer, because it's not so common to hear that.
As far as on the conservation programs,
kind of in sharecropping, in that sense of kind of the landowner and the tenant working together, and so the landowner kind of sharing the things that they want to see in terms of conservation as well.
Yeah, you bet. Well, I think the conversation is a lot easier if you are operating under a crop share arrangement. Where I'm leading up to is the fact that as an industry, we have trended away from this type of arrangement. But certainly if we're sharing in income and expenses and risk and reward, I think it really facilitates the discussion a lot easier, because I think 20, 30 years ago when crop share arrangements were much more common, there was more uncertainty in that relationship for a tenant to try some of these programs, because it's more of a partnership feel. When we're crop sharing, we're sharing in the income and we're sharing in the expenses. So from a crop share standpoint, I think it really makes the discussion a lot easier from my experience. I don't know if I specifically answered her question, Greg, but But, when we look at the cycles in agriculture, I think we'll always have cycles in ag. But, when you go back to the 70s, 80s, and 90s, what was the most common type of lease arrangement back then? If I was in front of the group, I'd ask for some participation, but that was a crop share arrangement. So cycles in agriculture won't change, but our point with this slide is farm leasing trends have, because when you look at the leasing trends, we have by far trended to the majority of leases being a fixed cash rent lease. So I think everybody is accustomed to a crop share arrangement, a fixed cash rent year to year. Our concern with the fixed cash rent again is it's year to year in nature. It has more uncertainty. It's a little harder to ask our tenant and have those conversations about, making some of these improvements to the farm. And that's leading me now to your question before, Greg, on a flexible cash rent lease. Does anybody know what percentage of cash rent leases in Iowa are now a flexible type of structure? I don't know if you're getting any answers in your chat box or not, Greg. But
I am not. 2% is what Sam said.
It's actually close to 20%. Just 10 years ago, it was less than 5%. So flex leases are trending, and that's why I like to spend the rest of my presentation focusing on the flex lease. I think everybody is accustomed to the fixed cash rent lease and a crop share, but there's actually some parts of Iowa we're seeing a third of the leases are flex lease. There's data over in Illinois that 30% of all new leases in Illinois are now being written under a flex lease structure. So they're definitely trending. And I think a lot of that, the reason for that is the volatility we're seeing in commodity prices and what's occurring with government payments. Just so much volatility. It's really hard when we're only sitting down at one given time in a year to negotiate rent. It's really becoming a lot more difficult to do that. So having a lease that can ebb and flow and be more flexible, I think is going to continue to become more popular. And, I would venture to guess at some point we'll see over half of leases in Iowa, maybe even upwards of 2/3 of leases in cash rent leases in Iowa being a flex type of structure. So this is a lot of numbers. I'll break this down, but one of the deterrents for a flex lease I have found is there's so many different ways to set them up. Also the perceived complication, but I'll break this down because I think once you see this, once you set it up, it's pretty simple and it facilitates, in our experience, a lot better longer term relationship. And so this is an example of a flex lease that has a $225 an acre base payment. So it still has a fixed cash rent component to it. It has a fixed payment of $225 per acre, but there's flexibility now for the rent to flex higher as gross revenue goes higher. So you can see here down at the bottom, the actual net rent will be the higher of the $225 base or 33% of the gross revenue, whichever one is higher. Let's just use an example here. For easy math, let's assume the average price is $5 a bushel for corn. This average price is a common question I get. How do we get that? That can be an average from the local elevator, a 4-month average, a 6-month average. I have some that we use the average of the spring and the fall crop insurance price. But let's just say, for example, we have an average of $5. The yield for corn is 200 bushel. You come over here, $5 times 200 bushel is $1,000 gross. $1,000 gross times our percentage of 33% comes to $330 an acre, $330 an acre. So in that case, this would trigger a bonus payment, a flex payment, in addition to the base. So there'd be a $95 an acre bonus paid. And typically these payment dates we set up, one half in March, the other half either in September through December time period. And then any flex payments, in this case, $95 an acre, we typically set those up that they're due on December 1st. So, so this is about the easiest, most simple way I found to set these up. Again, it's the rent is the higher of the base, or 33% of the gross revenue, whichever one is higher. And for anyone looking for a good article, Farm Futures magazine recently wrote an article I thought was very well written. The title of that was "It's Time to Get Serious About a Flexible Land Lease." That's where this graphic came from. So yeah, look that up on the internet. I think they did an excellent job of breaking this down.
Yeah, there's a couple of questions in here. One being about a flex lease around pasture or whole farm, but then also a couple of follow-ups to that about different crops. So maybe organic crops or a diversity of different crops. How do you account for that in a flex lease? So kind of two questions there.
You bet. So yeah, this is obviously an example of corn, but I think the nice thing about this is it can be applied to any crop. It's just a matter of getting an understanding of what the yield range and the pricing opportunities look like for any crop that we're working with. And as far as, so I think it would very much could be structured for organic crops. Now the question on pasture, full disclosure, I've never set one up on pasture. That'd be a little bit more of a difficult, not to say that it couldn't be done. I just have to give that some more thought. Because basically what this is doing is allowing the landowner to participate on the upside, with their tenant. What the landowner is giving up in this relationship is a concession on the base. This is a farm example that could probably be just rented out on a fixed cash rent basis of probably around $275 an acre, maybe even $300 an acre today. So the landowner is giving up the base part up front, but in recognition, the producer is willing to share a portion of their profit on the upside. So yeah, I'd have to give that more thought how it could be set up, Greg, on a pasture type of situation. But I'm happy to follow up with that, the individual that asked that question, after the fact. So
fantastic. And another question about is kind of back to the organic piece. Do you have any sources of where to find that pricing that would help in that deciding?
The pricing up at the top.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess I would need to get an understanding of where the delivery point is for those organic crops, who is the end user, the vendor, and how does the producer, what options does the producer have to actually price that crop is what we need to get a better understanding for.
Yeah. And another question around cover cropping in a flex lease, how would that be set up and who would pay for that?
Well, yeah, that's a great lead in, because one of the ending points I'm going to make on this flexible lease is it kind of has more of a partnership feel. And in my experience, the question about who should pay for cover crops becomes more of a mute issue with this type of arrangement, because it goes back to more of that crop share feel that we talked about before, even though it still has a fixed rent component. But since the producer feels like the landowner is making some concessions up front, in our experience, we found it takes a lot of less pressure having to account in our lease on who's paying for cover crops, because in most cases, the tenant's more than willing to go ahead and try them because they feel like they're being treated fairly up front.
Okay. And not sure if where this will take us, but there was a question about, is sharecropping the only way for the landowner to maintain some decision making in the operation, or is there some other tools for that?
Sure. Well, yeah, certainly with a fixed cash rent lease, generally speaking, the decision making diverts to the producer who's taking the risk. To us, this what we're looking at here in front of us. A flex lease is a a good compromise in the middle of a crop share and a fixed lease where there's still some sharing in the profits and risk. So it does open the door more of a conversation and transparency in our experience of what's occurring on that farm. And then we, certainly in the lease arrangement, certainly can be built in, if there's certain things the landowner would like to have some input on, those can always be accounted for in your lease.
Great, thank you.
I do see, Greg, we're about down to 10 minutes. Is that?
We are, that is correct.
All right, I better keep zipping along here. So one of the questions I get a lot is, how does this base rent established? Is this some arbitrary number? So we do have a process that we like to use to help establish where the base should be set. And it's, really going back to the basic of understanding the numbers. This is a farm that we worked with back in August of 2020. Again, a lot of rents are negotiated in August, September for the following year. So this is going back to August. We just looked at what 2021 prices were, took off the crop expenses. We like to build in some return for time and labor for the producer, recognizing that they're just not doing this for free. So what is left after their expenses to pay for rent? And you can see in this case, it kind of falls down in that range of where we set up this base for this particular example. Now, when we fast forward today and plug in today's prices, you can see that break even increases dramatically. But this illustrates that it's going to, for those folks that are working on a year-to-year lease, if prices hold, it's probably going to put a lot of pressure on rents to go higher next year when it's time to negotiate again. But the nice thing about this flex structure is we don't have to worry about so much now if prices go higher to adjust our rent, because our lease is going to do it for us. Here's another good reference. Think about your own farm. We have to go back to about 10 years ago to the last time we had commodity prices at these levels. Where were cash rent levels at that time? And this is just comparing 3 different districts from the Iowa State Cash Rent Survey. You can see back then rents were back, kind of down in that 225 area. Here's another reference point. Cash rent is a percentage of gross revenue. And this is a chart from Iowa State showing a 10-year average that it's about 30 to 33% on corn and 40% on soybeans. And that ironically is the percentages a lot of times we use in our flex leases is 30 to 33% for corn and 40% for soybeans. But when you just take that times those numbers historically, you can see again, we're at that 220 area, which kind of ties into where we set the base rent on this particular lease.
Now, Mike, when it was setting up a 5-year lease, how often do you adjust that base?
So, it's not that we set up the lease and we don't have to, we can just walk away from it forever. It's still important to keep an eye on it and make tweaks to it. But when we see major movements in the market and cycles, if these strong prices hold for the next 2 or 3 years, I could see that we have to start bumping this base rent up, maybe up to 250 range. Even when we had back in the high of $7 corn, the highest our base rents ever got was $300 an acre. But again, there's less pressure because the upside's open, so it can still flex higher. But it's still important to keep an eye on it and make adjustments to it as needed.
All right. And then one other question about marketing and timing of or let me just read it. How does marketing and timing by the producer work with a flex lease?
So if you're basing your price on a 4-month average from the local delivery point, it really isn't tied to the producer's marketing. Same if you use a average of a spring and fall crop insurance price that's released. I do have a couple that the landowner actually uses the the producer's actual selling price. So they're willing to take the risk on that their tenant's a good marketer. But that's about the true flex lease that I have, is where we're actually, everything is actual sell price, actual yield. But not every landowner is willing to take that risk. And in some cases, if the producer is marketing into the next year, we have to delay that flex payment, if there is one, till the following year, when all the crop has been, after the crop's all been marketed.
Great. And we have about 4 minutes left before we got to sign off.
Okay, well, we're probably not going to get, unfortunately, through all the slides. So let me just, well, with 4 minutes, I'm just going to go to my last slide then. I did have an interview with a female landowner we work with that uses a flex lease, but unfortunately, we're not going to be able to play that. But anybody would like the full presentation, by the way, send me an email. I'm happy to share this interview as well. But basically, to bring it all home, we think a flex lease is a modern day alternative for you to consider. It kind of wraps the crop share and traditional cash rent lease all into one. We think it facilitates more of a marriage versus the pull and tug sometimes with a year-to-year arrangement. My parents use a flex lease now that my dad's retired from farming. They would never allow me to interview them, but I know the comments they've made is they don't enjoy that annual rent negotiation with a fixed lease. So this flex lease, where it kind of dictates the rent itself, they enjoy that and enjoy the relationship better with their tenant. We think it matches up the landowners and producers' goal much better, especially land stewardship, cover crops, where we have more of a partnership. Joanne, who I interviewed that we didn't get to play, that's one thing that she mentions in her interviews, the partnership feel of this flex lease arrangement. And the last thing is, a key component in my experience is the base needs to be set at a reasonable level. Though everybody that I run across that has had a bad experience with a flex lease, it usually has to do that the base part of that rent is set maybe too aggressive, too high. And again, it has to be a give and take from both sides. And if both sides feel like they're being treated fairly, that tends to promote more of a partnership, a better long-term relationship, better care of the land, all the things that most landowners are looking for, as well as producers. So we do offer a complimentary custom flex lease analysis if you're interested. We also offer to sit down, whether it's a landowner that's interested in introducing it to their tenant or the producer interested in introducing it to a landowner. Either way, we also offer to help facilitate that just from a third party to answer questions and just from our experience. So with that, Greg, I don't know if there's any final questions, and apologize.
Fantastic.
Yep.
That's no problem.